Hello everyone, it's Karen at the Cool Tools Studio. I'm here today to offer an introduction to Phoenix Torch Fireable Clay. Like any clay, Phoenix clay has unique working qualities that should be kept in mind while creating. My goal in this video is to offer up as much information as possible to assure that you can move forward with this clay and create confidently. So let's open up a pack and get right to it. My first impression of this clay is that it's very dense. It's malleable and elastic, but it has a density to it that ends up lending it some strength and rigidity that I actually ended up really liking. So I'm going to start off by using Cool Slip. This clay behaves well with Cool Slip. To prep my work surface in my roller, I'm just going to show you how it rolls really nicely with minimal sticking. And then when I kind of pick it up, it doesn't flop over. It kind of holds its form and shape a little bit. And then another benefit of this strength and rigidity that it kind of has built in is that it textures really well, and it's harder to mar or damage the texture. I can kind of pick it up directly on it and touch it, and I'm not worried about distorting and smudging away my texture or anything. I found that the Phoenix clay cuts really well with minimal drag. And there isn't really much of an edge that you're going to have to clean up either. So this clay kind of has a little bit of a memory as a result of how dense it is. And in some ways that's great. If you are wanting a slightly softer clay, you can condition this clay and kind of lessen that memory. Some of the instances where you would want to do that would be if perhaps you're draping your clay over a form. If you don't condition it, it might kind of rise as it dries a little bit and try to return to the flattened sheet that it was rolled in. Also, if you want the piece to dry very flat, that would be another instance where you might want to condition the clay prior to use. So conditioning is not necessary for all uses, but I just want to be covering all the bases here. So if you are going to be forming your clay or wanting your clay super flat and finding that it has a bit of a memory, or tactilely you're like, this is a little stiff, I would like it softer, you can condition it one of two ways. You can either knead it between your fingertips. If you're doing this, you want to make sure that you've prepped your fingers with some claymate or some gloves in a bottle. That way you're not drawing moisture out of your clay. And just by kneading it, I'm softening it and kind of reducing that memory that the clay may exhibit. And it's just already kind of a softer, smoother consistency. It's not as rigid. Another way that you can condition your clay, I'm going to grab a fresh blob for that. Is just by rolling it. I'm just going to grab 3 cards here. And just kind of rolling and folding. There's also an opportunity here that if you feel like the clay is a little dry, you can spritz in some distilled water. I think it feels fine, but depending on what you're using it for, you can always add some moisture at this time. But this is also going to kind of soften up your clay. So I wish you could feel it. It's difficult to describe, but it is softer now. So again, you certainly don't have to always condition. It's not necessary for all applications, but conditioning the clay will make it softer if you prefer a clay that isn't quite as rigid and isn't exhibiting a memory. Just to offer some examples on instances where it would be beneficial to condition your clay, say you're doing dry construction and you're going to be putting something on top of something that you wanted to be perfectly flat. That would be an instance where you would want to condition your clay. This little strip that I made, I did not condition, and as it dried, it got a slight bend to it. Nothing crazy, and that would in fact fire out in the kiln. This one was put in curvy and fired perfectly flat. But this piece was conditioned, and you can see that it dried nice and flat. While we're on the topic of drying and being particular about it, I did also find that in addition to condition your clay prior to drying it, drying your pieces on a tile led to the most flat results. And this is just for shapes that are kind of long like this. Just by nature, they tend to curl. For something like this, if you wanted it to be perfectly flat, placing it on a tile and then on a heat source, air dry, dehydrator, it doesn't matter. For whatever reason, just leaving it on the tile produces the most flat results. Usually when you're drying metal clay, it's recommended that you flip so it dries evenly. I actually found that the clay kind of sticking to the tile as it dried helped it dry perfectly flat. So if you're really particular and you want your piece perfectly flat because you're joining it with something, or your project is complex and you can't wait for it to flatten out in the kiln, you can dry on a tile to get nice flat results. All clays are impacted by environmental factors such as humidity and heat, but I found, and I think most of you will as well, that Phoenix clay retains moisture really well and has a moderate working time, which makes it ideal for coiling, like I did for these two projects. I didn't have any cracking along the edges that you can sometimes have when you're coiling and your clay is drying out as you're bending it. It was also excellent to work with for kind of additive qualities. For this ring, it started out with just a band, and then I kind of just plopped this texture on top, and then I just sculpted and added pieces of clay and blended out to kind of make this one form. The Phoenix clay takes even a high level of detail very well. This was made from a mold from an actual cicada, and you can see the texture in the wings just turned out beautifully. I found that the Phoenix clay built really well with dry construction, which is what I used for making this little poison ring. It has a little hidden vessel there. And it also sculpts really well. I used Wannery Tanner's hollow form system here, and all the seams joined really, really successfully, and I really enjoyed making this spinning pendant using the Phoenix Torch Fireable Clay as well. Let's move right along by talking about the working qualities that this clay possesses while in the greenware state. For joining pieces that are dry to dry, like small embellishments, this clay actually wets and makes a slip really, really readily. So I'm just going to take a brush and dampen the area and allow it to soak a little bit. And then it's hard to dampen the back of a tiny little element like that. So for something like this, I just apply some water to my tough card and kind of swirl it and just kind of soften that face. Let that soak for a little bit too. Kind of creating a slip there. And just using water will be sufficient for just simple, lightweight embellishments like this. So as far as paste goes for this clay, it's actually so soft that you can add a little bit of water. I'm just kind of pressing it in with this clay shaper. But I actually found that you can work with it straight out of the package because it is so sticky that I'm just going to scoop some on my shaper there and then dampen the two connection spots. And then you're able to just work with the lump clay for connections. I'm just kind of scooping. Some off there. So it's a very, it's just the lump clay at this point where you can work with a very dry paste, but you don't have to put in a lot of water to get this clay to stick and adhere. Applying a little bit of pressure, and then I'll come in with a brush to clean up my connections that are supported with clay or paste. And then after this dries, you can certainly come in with some more clay and kind of fatten up those edges to again solidify that connection. But I found in all my testing that this clay makes very strong connections when joined with just the lump clay or very very slightly watered down paste. So while we're on the topic of greenware clay, got some more samples here to talk about shaping in the greenware phase. This clay is very sturdy when dried, and it can be shaped in the greenware phase with either a sanding stick or a file. A note that I would like to make when you're filing or using a sanding stick, or if you're using sanding pads for refinement, because this clay is so dense, it creates a very, very fine dust when sanded. And I'll just go ahead and show that there. Because it is so fine, especially if you're working in an environment that has fans or moving air, I'm just going to recommend that you wear a dust mask to protect yourself from inhaling any fine silver. It's just a really, really fine powder, and it could readily kind of rise up into the air. So just a precautionary note, if you don't already wear a mask when you sand, it's a good practice to take on if you're working with this Phoenix Torch Fireable Clay. So again, it can be sanded and shaped pretty quickly. And as always, you kind of want to make sure you're supporting your clay close to the edges that you're sanding to lessen your chance of breaking. But this clay is extremely sturdy in the greenware phase, and in working with it, I've found myself breaking a lot less pieces than I usually do. So that's a definite perk. Another result of this clay being so dense, which leads to its strength, is that it's kind of difficult to drill. If you were going to start off with, like these hand drills come with different sized bits, it'd be kind of difficult to just dive right in with the, it'd be kind of difficult to just dive right on in with the thickest drill bit there. So I usually like to start off with a small drill bit and then kind of work my way up to the larger drill bit. Again, just a note from having been working with this clay and testing it for a while. While we're on the topic of greenware, this clay is an ideal candidate for greenware refinement. Earlier I had mentioned sanding pads with a mask. And for this clay, I usually start off with the superfine, and we'll work to ultrafine, and then finally microfine. And I'll just really quickly kind of hit this edge. Again, there's that kind of fine dust that I was talking about. But it really quickly cleans up. And this clay is unique in that as you're sanding it, again, result of that really, really fine particle, it ends up coming up to a shine before you've even fired it, just because those small particles are able to really lock in and kind of burnish while it's in the greenware phase even. So here I'm hitting this top surface. You can see it's getting a little shiny. So once you fire something that you've sanded all the way up to the microfine, it's gonna come out with a absolutely beautiful shine and a really high polish. If the whole sanding thing and wearing a mask is a little bit messy for you, this clay is also an ideal candidate for wet refinement. I've just got a foam healing tool here that I'm just gonna dampen and wipe off here to remove excess moisture, because a little bit goes a long way. And you can just use that in a circular motion. And this method works by kind of taking the particles from the high areas and reallocating them into the low areas, and is a great way to kind of clean up edges and even things out. And again, these particles are really, really small, so they're filling in nice and tightly, and that's also going to polish up very well. And earlier I kind of mentioned burnishing and how it kind of has a burnished effect. You can burnish this clay before you fire it. And that's just another way that you can really bring this clay up to a really high shine. You won't have to do hardly anything once it's fired, because you already kind of put the work in while it's in greenware. And again, it's always good to, I was kind of holding it up so you could see, but it's always good to burnish against a stable surface and support your pieces when you're applying pressure like this. But this clay is very sturdy, and that also makes it an ideal candidate for burnishing. I'm not as worried about breaking it as I potentially could be when exerting this much force on a piece of greenware. But like I said before, this stuff is sturdy. So that you can really see, it's already looking like metal. And when you fire that, it's going to shine up beautifully. One final greenware note is flexibility. If you're big into kind of dry construction and you're going to be asking your clay to make bends in the greenware phase, this is just the Phoenix clay dried, and it's got moderate flex and bend to it. I can kind of ask it to make some gentle bends, and that means that I'm not super worried about bending it and breaking it while I'm working. But I don't think I would be doing construction with it. But if you add just a little bit of glycerin, it becomes very bendy. So for this piece, I just added 2 drops of glycerin and dried, and that I would feel comfortable bending and working with. It was also noted that the addition of glycerin did make a longer strip like this kind of bend a little bit and curl when it was drying, but because it's so malleable, you can just work any curves that it might acquire while drying out of it. Let's move on by talking about firing. Like all precious metal clays, you want to ensure that your clay is bone dry prior to firing it. Failure to do so will result in bubbles in your sintered work. Phoenix's binder retains water, which results in this clay having a wonderfully long working time. However, it also means that this clay may take longer to dry than other precious metal clays. I like to make sure my pieces, especially larger ones, are completely dry prior to firing them by placing them on a mug warmer or in a dehydrator for 15 to 20 minutes right before I fire them. Phoenix clay, depending on what is potentially embedded in it, or if it's being co-fired with glass, or even how much time is available for the clay to be sintered, has several firing schedules, all of which produce a very successful sinter. You can fire Phoenix clay in a kiln as low as 1,100 degrees for 45 minutes. And you can fire it all the way up to 1,650 degrees for anywhere from 5 minutes to 2 hours for maximum strength. Just to clear up any confusion that you may have with these firing schedules, this is a minimum temp and a minimum time. You can fire at 1,100 degrees for longer than 45 minutes if you would like, but it must be fired at a minimum of 45 minutes. You're never going to fire your clay for too long at a certain temperature. You can take it too hot and experience melting, but you're never going to fire your clay for too long. So for example, the 1650 schedule here, you can do that for as little as 5 minutes and have a sinter, or if you'd be more comfortable, you can let it hold for 2 hours for a maximum strength to your fired clay. The Phoenix clay is also torch fireable, and I actually have a sample here to walk you through how to fire it with a torch. So before I dive right in and start firing, let's take a moment to talk about safety. Whenever you're using a torch, you want to be working in a kind of fireproof, safe area. So I'm going to be firing on a ceramic fiber kiln shelf here, and then I have it in an annealing pan. This is my preferred firing environment just because I know that if I'm torching and I go to come off the heat, I kind of have this grace area here where I know I'm not going to catch anything on fire. You could also take your ceramic fiber brick and place it on some bricks or some fireproof tiles, but you want to make sure that you're working in a safe environment that is clear of any flammable objects. You want to pull back any long hair. And then if your sleeves were loose, you'd want to scoot those back as well, or change into an outfit with tighter fitting sleeves. As always, you want to be wearing safety glasses. And then you want to make sure that you're working in a well-ventilated environment as well. We're going to be burning off a binder and creating a little bit of smoke, and you want to make sure that you're not breathing that into your lungs. So on the instruction card here, you can see that for torch firing, you want to maintain a peachy glow for 4 to 5 minutes. And that's a little bit contingent upon the size of the piece that you're firing, but in general, that's the key to success here. So I'm just going to place my little strip here on my firing surface, and then I've got my butane torch here. And just because it's sometimes hard to hear over the noise of the torch, I'm going to really quickly run through what to expect. You're going to approach your piece with your heat, and then it's going to ignite, and you're going to visibly see a little bit of flame on your piece as all your binders burn away. You're going to continue to keep the heat on your piece, moving it constantly so you don't overheat one area, until it comes up to a peachy glow. And then that is the sign that you've reached your target temperature, and that's the color that you want to keep your torch on to maintain. I'm going to be lowering the lights here because it's a lot easier to see the color that your piece is glowing when you're working in a low environment area, and you're much less likely to melt your piece that way. So I'm here igniting my torch, and then I'm going to kind of warm the area around my piece and just kind of gently bring my flame onto my clay. And again, I'm kind of going to be looking for that initial flame and that flare up where my binder is going to be burning off. There it goes. And then I'm going to keep heating my piece. Again, I'm moving my flame constantly. You can kind of see it curling as it's shrinking and that binder's sneaking off and burning away. But again, you can see it relaxing here. And I hope you can all see the color that it's glowing now. It does have that kind of peachy color to it. And that's the color that I'm trying to maintain for my 4 minutes here. Again, you're always moving your flame. If you were just kind of sitting and hanging out over here, it would become easy to overheat just one part. You want to heat your piece as a whole. So I've had my flame on my piece for about 4 minutes, and that is sufficient for a piece this size. So at this point, I'm taking my flame off. And then, since I don't have any gemstones or anything that's going to suffer from thermal shock here, I can quench this piece. And I'm bringing up my water to my fireproof environment instead of bringing my piece over and across a non-fire safe surface. And I'm just dropping it in. And that's a quench. It rapidly cools your metal so that you can handle it. So just to test the center here, I gave it a nice bend. And you can see that we didn't break. This piece joined together very successfully when being heated with a torch for 4 minutes. While we're on the topic of firing, let's talk about compatible firing material. You just saw me torch firing on a ceramic fiber kiln shelf, but this clay can also be successfully fired on a hard ceramic kiln shelf, on a super wool fiber blanket, or in a fused silica dish containing either alumina hydrate, vermiculite, or superfine vermiculite. So I'm just going to wrap this video up with some odds and ends and interesting working qualities of this clay. Something that I stumbled upon that I'm really excited about is that it doesn't soak solder as much as other sintered precious metal clays does. We think it's a result of the super dense kind of consistency and the really fine particles that make up the sintered clay. So I'm just going to demonstrate. Here I've got, just like any other soldering job that you're going to be doing on precious metal clay, you want to burnish the area that you're going to be applying the solder to. And this is just a torch-fired sample that you just saw me sinter. I'm applying flux. It's fine silver, so it's not going to be producing any oxides, but I still like to apply flux because it kind of helps my solder stay put and helps solder flow. So I'm going to be heating up my solder there and then moving it over and then heating the piece, and you'll see it flow. But unlike other soldering jobs on precious metal clay, I'm not going to be working against that soak as much as you would. So that I'm really excited about, because sometimes it's really difficult to solder on a precious metal clay because the solder is drawn down into the clay as opposed to flowing in between the two pieces to be joined. So I'm just going to heat that up and demonstrate. Over here, preheating my metal in that flux. Make it nice and sticky. And then this is 3 little chips of solder. And move it over to my clay. And you can see it flowing on the surface there and spreading out because this whole piece is hot, but it's not going anywhere. It's not soaking in. And this clay was just torch fired. It didn't have the extra long soak at 1650, and it still is doing a really good job not soaking solder. So I'm really excited about that. In all the testing that I did, I was really happy with the way that this clay enameled. These 2 pieces were sintered with a torch prior to the enamel being applied. And again, they didn't really exhibit any like soak or drawing away of moisture like you can sometimes have when you're enameling on precious metal clay. And that made it really easy to kind of blend out colors, and just the enamel lays on beautifully. These pieces were fired in a kiln, And I wanted to test out kind of a Champlavet style enameling and then enameling on a three-dimensional surface. And again, it just enameled beautifully. I was really happy with the results of those tests as well. Because Phoenix clay is fine silver and has low fire options, it can be co-fired with glass. There are detailed fire instructions for glass on the back side of the firing guide. I've really put this Phoenix Torch Fireable Clay to the test, and I've had a lot of fun working with it. I really enjoyed that I'm able to kind of alter it to what I'm working with by either conditioning it or leaving it stiff straight out of the packaging. It's passed all my tests with flying colors, and I can't wait to see what you all make with it. I really enjoyed working with Phoenix Torch Fireable Clay, and I know you're going to love it too. Thanks for watching.